How much humiliation can a man swallow before something inside him decides it's enough? The sound of Joseph's boot against Thomas's back cracked across the polished gym floor like a starter pistol. The 42-year-old janitor stumbled forward, palms skidding across the wet tiles, his mop clattering away as 20 wealthy students looked on. Their silence was heavy. Some eyes darted away, some lingered, all complicit. Maybe if you spent less time watching real fighters and more time scrubbing, these mats would actually shine, Joseph sneered, stepping over Thomas as though he were discarded trash. A moment later, his foot caught the mop bucket, sending grimy water cascading across Thomas's uniform. There. Now you've got something real to clean. Thomas rose slowly, his clothes soaked, his hands trembling. Not from fear, but from something deeper, something dormant yet dangerous. In his eyes burned the knowledge of 2 decades in the ring, knowledge that could dismantle Joseph in seconds. The gym manager, Jessica, looked away. The students shifted uneasily. Joseph laughed, oblivious to the storm he was awakening. For 3 years, Thomas had been invisible. Each evening at 6 p.m., he slipped through the back door of Iron Forge Academy with his cart and bucket, becoming part of the scenery, like the motivational posters plastered across the walls or the rows of leather punching bags that hung like executioners in chrome and glass. 8,000 square feet of prime Phoenix real estate, towering windows gazing out at upscale Scottsdale. This was Joseph's kingdom. Joseph, 35, brash, sculpted, 30% owner of the gym, was an emperor of image. His Instagram flashed reels of knockouts, flexing photos with executives and influencers, captions preaching the gospel of alpha mentality. He was a man who never quite made it to the big leagues of professional fighting, but built a throne training those rich enough to afford his delusions. His kingdom, however, had a flaw he couldn't see. The janitor quietly sweeping through his empire each night, eyes sharp, absorbing every detail. While Joseph taught his students sloppy combinations and reckless defenses, Thomas's gaze caught every mistake, every dangerous flaw. He wiped mirrors with the same discipline he once threw punches. His Golden Gloves trophy, his military combatives medals, his competitive martial arts years, all gathered dust in a storage unit across town. Now, for $12 an hour, he pushed a mop to keep food on the table for his 16-year-old daughter, Karen. At home, Karen waited under a yellow kitchen light, textbooks spread across the table. She no longer asked why her father worked nights at a job so beneath his skill. Cancer bills from her mother's illness had taught her the cost of survival. Thomas carried those bills in his spine, every step back to that apartment a reminder of sacrifice. Not everyone was blind. Coach Charles, a veteran trainer with a weathered face and 25 years of experience, noticed the way Thomas instinctively corrected his stance when watching grappling drills. The way his hands, even while holding a rag, always found their way into a fighter's guard position. Charles knew muscle memory when he saw it, but Jessica filed complaints in silence, locking them away with the others. 3 minority staff had already quit, unable to endure Joseph's toxic reign. Thomas, though, endured it. He had no choice. Every insult, every kick, every bucket of dirty water, he absorbed them like body shots, bracing himself for Karen's future. Meanwhile, Joseph poured his attention into his prize student, George, a 21-year-old college wrestler with raw talent and a father's money. But talent without defense is a candle in the wind. George's guard was weak, his instincts sloppy, his training dangerously flawed. Joseph never corrected it because Joseph didn't know how. And every night as Thomas swept the ring and wiped sweat from mirrors, he saw it. Every weakness, every opening, every lie disguised as expertise. Thomas was underestimated, invisible. But invisible does not mean powerless. Part of him wanted to speak. The smarter part knew that speaking meant losing the paycheck that kept Karen's lights on. So he swallowed it. Every jab of pride, every bruise shaped like Joseph's ego, and clocked in. Clocked out. But after midnight, when the gym was only hum and echo, the cameras blinking like lazy stars, Thomas sometimes forgot how to be invisible. His reflection would call him out. Shoulders slipped into a fighter's frame. Hips turned like a hinge. Sharp jabs at phantoms. Combinations that flowed the way a good poem breathes. Measure, music, meaning. In those stolen rounds with his own shadow, Thomas remembered the truth. He was dangerous, and Joseph had no idea what was waking up. At 6:45 p.m., George limped in with a black eye and a pride that hurt worse. 21. A wrestler with money behind him and potential in front of him. Submitted in the first round by a smaller fighter using a basic rear naked choke. The very move Joseph had fixed with the worst advice a coach could give. "It's not your fault," Joseph barked, pacing in front of the mirrors like a lion sniffing for applause. "These street fighter types don't respect proper technique. They fight dirty." The mop in Thomas's hands tightened. He'd watched Joseph drill that mistake into George for months. Chin up, elbows wide, the neck offered like a gift. A defense that wasn't defense at all, just a slow surrender. "The problem is these thugs learn to fight in alleys," Joseph continued, voice rising for the crowd. "No discipline, no art. It's not real martial arts." George nodded, swallowing blame that wasn't his. Thomas moved closer, ostensibly to clean around the heavy bags. He could smell the lie. It smelled like disinfectant and the iron taste of a bite guard. "That's why technique always beats brute force," Joseph declared. He raised his chin high and flared his arms, performing the same fatal mistake. "See? This is correct form." "No," Thomas said, barely above a breath. It was enough. Joseph stopped mid-demonstration. Heads turned. The AC hummed like a warning. Jessica looked up from the desk, eyes already calculating exits and outcomes. "What did you say?" Joseph's voice sharpened. "Nothing, sir. Sorry." Thomas lowered his gaze, bringing the mop back to the floor, as if the word could be rinsed away. But Joseph could smell an audience and a challenge. He stepped into Thomas's space. "No, please. The janitor wants to teach technique now." The sarcasm curled. "You think pushing a mop qualifies you to coach champions?" Silence thinned. Students drifted closer in a slow orbit. George's face was flushed with confusion. His trust was a fragile thing. Jessica's hand hovered near her phone. "I asked you a question," Joseph snapped. Thomas finally met his eyes, steady, level. "You're teaching him wrong," he said. "That defense will get him hurt." A ripple moved through the room, not a shout, worse, a murmur, doubt arriving on soft feet. Joseph laughed, but it was the brittle kind. 20 years of training and you know better?" "I know that keeping your chin high in a choke is suicide," Thomas answered, quiet as a judge. Something shifted. Students glanced from Joseph to Thomas like a metronome measuring credibility. Joseph felt it. Authority is a mask. Once it slips, everyone notices. "Fine," he said, pointing at the heavy bag. "Show us your expert technique. Demonstrate proper form for the class." "I just cleaned over there," Thomas replied. "I'm ordering you to demonstrate, unless you're admitting you don't know what you're talking about." It was a perfect trap. Refuse and look like a liar. Comply and reveal who he really was. Thomas looked around. George's eyes bewildered. Jessica's worried. Phones up, recording, for safety, for spectacle, for proof. He set the mop aside. He walked to the bag. What happened next would not be forgotten. The first combination landed like a verdict. Jab, cross, hook. Clean, effortless, inevitable. The 100-pound bag bucked back 3 feet. The chain above it groaned as if the ceiling felt the weight of truth. His feet were a blueprint. His hips were a piston. His guard was a promise kept. The room didn't cheer. It inhaled. The second combination hit like a storm. The heavy bag swung so violently it nearly tore from its chain. Dead silence flooded the gym. Joseph's jaw slackened, his face a mask of disbelief. George's eyes widened, because this finally was the way a fighter was supposed to move. Thomas froze. Regret flashed across his face the moment his fists fell back to his sides. He had revealed too much. Joseph's face, already crimson, curdled into purple rage. Humiliation had stripped him bare in front of the people who paid for his authority. "Don't ever disrespect me in my own gym again," Joseph hissed, voice trembling not with fear but with fury. "Or you'll be looking for a new job tomorrow." But the damage was done. Students had seen the truth. The janitor moved with a mastery their polished instructor never had. And once seen, truth cannot be unseen. That night, Joseph sat hunched over his laptop, scouring every database, every dusty record he could find. By dawn, fragments of Thomas's past had surfaced like bones. Amateur boxing results, military service files, yellowing newspaper clippings of a young Golden Gloves champion who looked far too much like the man mopping his floors. Instead of retreating, Joseph's fragile ego doubled down. If Thomas was a threat, then Thomas would be destroyed. Week 1. Humiliation. The campaign began with precision. Joseph scheduled emergency cleanings during peak sparring hours, forcing Thomas to mop while sweat and blood dripped onto freshly scrubbed floors. Joseph loomed nearby, arms crossed, smirking. "Careful with the equipment, boy," he'd announced loud enough for the students to hear. The word boy was wielded like a weapon, sharp, deliberate, calculated to sting. Old enough to carry history, subtle enough to dodge formal complaints. Jessica behind the front desk took notes. She prayed she'd never need them. Thomas endured it all. He had known worse in his life. Rent was due in 10 days. Karen needed school clothes. Pride was a luxury he could not afford. But Joseph wasn't satisfied with quiet submission. He needed domination. Every morning he prowled the gym to inspect Thomas's work, finding fault where none existed. "These mirrors have streaks," he'd say, pointing at glass so spotless it gleamed. Thomas would re-clean the same surface 3 times while Joseph watched with smug satisfaction. Even Joseph's bathroom breaks became rituals of degradation, perfectly timed to corner Thomas with fresh insults about knowing your station and accepting reality. Trainers averted their eyes, unwilling to witness the slow dismantling of a man's dignity. Week 2. Psychological warfare. Joseph escalated. He began sharing those old clippings with his inner circle, spinning a new narrative. "Did you know our janitor thought he was a fighter once?" He'd announce in group sessions, loud enough for Thomas to hear. "Golden Gloves, apparently. Look how that turned out." Students laughed uneasily. George didn't. He had been watching Thomas closely since the heavy bag incident. He saw the subtle shifts, the unconscious way Thomas's weight balanced during drills, the perfect guard positions formed, even while wiping down equipment. George recognized what Joseph refused to acknowledge, the truth of muscle memory, the rhythm of real skill. Joseph took the humiliation online, his Instagram filled with pointed captions, pictures of the gym's luxury equipment with Thomas blurred in the background, bent over a mop. "Stay humble. Know your place." His followers lapped it up, sharing memes about janitors with delusions of grandeur. But for Joseph, this wasn't just cruelty. It was survival. His identity, his empire, his fragile image as alpha male all hinged on being untouchable. A janitor who could throw better combinations than him? That was an existential threat, one that had to be crushed, so the harassment escalated. Every day, a new insult. Every night, a new trap. And Thomas, the invisible man with fire in his hands, endured it all. For now. Joseph's cruelty became theater. He timed his loudest sparring sessions for the exact moments Thomas needed to clean near the mats, every shout and strike designed to drown out dignity. He encouraged students to joke about ambitious janitors while Thomas was within earshot, their laughter thin and nervous, daggers disguised as humor. And then Joseph escalated. Thomas was no longer just background noise. He became a prop. "See how a real fighter controls distance?" Joseph barked, shoving Thomas backward mid-demonstration. "Some people think watching makes them experts." The students chuckled uneasily. Thomas steadied himself. He said nothing. He endured. Week 3. Breaking point. "Thomas, hold the pads." It wasn't a request. The gym was packed, students circling, phones ready. Thomas looked up from arranging equipment. "I'm not trained for that, sir." Joseph smirked. "You seemed confident enough last week. Hold the pads." The circle closed tighter. Thomas reluctantly slipped on the focus mitts. Joseph began light, controlled combinations, narrating each move for the class. But gradually the strikes grew heavier, sharper. The sound of glove against pad cracked like a whip. "See how I adjust my angles?" Joseph said, raining blows that rattled Thomas's shoulders. A real fighter adapts. Thomas held steady. His face betrayed nothing. Years of military discipline buried every wince, but Joseph's eyes gleamed. He wasn't after instruction, he was after blood. Shots began to stray, accidentally missing the mitts. Punches glanced off Thomas's forearms, his ribs, his shoulder. Oops, Joseph sneered. Better reflexes next time. Then it came. The strike to Thomas's left shoulder, the one Joseph had somehow discovered was old and fragile from a military injury. Pain shot like lightning down his arm. The pad slipped from his hands. His right fist clenched on instinct, ready to answer back. For a heartbeat, the room held its breath. Then Thomas forced the fist open. He stepped away, massaging his shoulder. "That's right. Walk away like you always do," Joseph called after him, loud enough for the class to hear. "At least you know your place." The public humiliation. But Joseph wasn't finished. His masterstroke came that weekend. The gym's security footage of Thomas's heavy bag demonstration appeared on Joseph's Instagram, captioned, "When the help thinks they can fight." Know your place? Humility. Iron Forge. The video went viral overnight. Thousands of views, hundreds of comments, most of them dripping with contempt. Stick to mopping. Janitor thinks he's Rocky. Know your role. On Sunday night, Karen found it. She sat on her bed, phone shaking in her hands, tears streaming as she scrolled through strangers tearing her father apart. When Thomas walked in, she looked up, her voice trembling. "Dad, why don't you fight back?" He had no answer that wouldn't break her heart further. A dangerous spark. On Monday, Coach Charles found Thomas in the supply closet, slumped on a crate, head in his hands among bottles of bleach and disinfectant. "I saw the video," Charles said softly. Thomas didn't look up. "I need this job. He's going to destroy me if I fight back." Charles's voice hardened. "I heard him talking to Jessica. He's planning to fire you anyway. Replacement's already in the works." Finally, Thomas lifted his head. Charles saw something there he hadn't seen before. Not resignation, not endurance. Something older, sharper, dangerous. That night at 2:17 a.m., the gym was empty. The last of the staff had gone home. Cameras blinked silently in the corners. Thomas walked to the heavy bag, the same one that had betrayed him weeks earlier, and laid his hands against it. For the first time, he stopped pretending. Thomas left his cart where it stood and peeled back the paper towels like a man revealing a secret. Beneath the mundane roll were his hand wraps, leather straps polished smooth by a lifetime of practice, frayed at the edges but faithful. He wrapped them around his knuckles as if greeting an old friend. The first combination came out the way memory remembers itself. Effortless, inevitable. Jab, cross, hook, uppercut. Each punch landed with surgical accuracy and the blunt force of something that had been built, hammered, and honed for years. The heavy bag rocked under the impacts, chains groaning as though the ceiling were old enough to sigh. If anyone competent had been watching, they would have stopped the world to take notes. Coach Charles was the only one who did. The 60-year-old trainer had returned to the gym for his keys and froze behind the glass, breath caught. Thomas wasn't merely throwing punches, he was teaching without a word. Footwork that read like a blueprint. Combinations stitched together cleanly. Defensive patterns that belonged in a program, not in a janitor's memory. Charles slipped inside so quietly Thomas felt the air change. Thomas flowed into grappling transitions, hips turning, weight shifting with the kind of economy that betrays decades inside ring ropes and drill mats. Muscle memory, the kind that can't be mimicked from a viral clip, ruled his body. "Holy hell," Charles breathed. Caught mid-movement, Thomas spun, and for a second both men simply stared at the truth in front of them. "How long?" Charles asked. "Golden Gloves regional champ, 2003 through 2007, Thomas answered, taking the wraps off slowly. "Combat instructor in the military for 8 years, mixed martial arts since then, about 15 years total." Charles's head shook, slow with disbelief and something like admiration. He's been teaching these kids garbage for 3 years, Charles said. You watched him do this every night? Every night, Thomas said, the weight of the confession heavy in his voice. I couldn't say anything. I need this job. Not anymore, Charles cut in. His face hardened. Not if it means he can plan your end before you even try. I heard him today talking to Jessica about replacements. You're done whether you fight or not. The words landed like hooks. Thomas felt a small, private collapse. Every humiliation swallowed. Every morning he'd gone back to work, threatening to have been for nothing. Rent. Karen's school supplies. The thin ledger of survival he kept in his head was unspooling. There's more, Charles said. Jessica's been logging complaints, students and staff. She's building a case. The owner is looking into Joseph. He paused, choosing what to say next like a coach calling plays. But Joseph won't stop at firing you. I heard him on the phone. He's talking about burying you, ruining your name so no one will touch you. This is bigger than harsh words. Thomas sank against the bag, breath shallow. Karen's applications are due in 6 months. I can't be without work. Charles stepped closer. The old trainer's voice softened but sharpened at the edges. What if we flip it? What if you stop being the story and become the author? What if you expose him, not with whispers, but with a public challenge? Thomas looked up, the idea landing like a foreign weight. You mean, call him out? Fight him? A formal challenge, Charles said. Fighter to fighter. Right here, in front of his students, live for his followers. Force him to either accept or admit he's a fraud. Joseph's whole brand is that he's untouchable. Make him prove it. Thomas shook his head before reason could be argued away. He'll never agree. He will if it's done to hurt his image, Charles said, pulling out his phone. He thumbed to Joseph's latest post and held the screen where Thomas could see. The clip from 3 nights ago, Joseph's caption dripping humiliation. When the help thinks they can fight. Know your place. Humility. Comments below were a swarm, mocking, racist, cruel. See, Charles said. That's a wound he cares about. He can't resist proving he's the real deal when his ego is on the line. You challenge him, the crowd watches, his students, his followers. They'll pressure him, he'll take it. Or he'll have to admit he's not what he sells. Thomas felt something harden inside him that wasn't anger so much as resolve. Charles wasn't offering pity. He was offering a plan. A weapon forged from truth, public pressure, and one man's skill, finally given the stage it deserved. Outside, the gym clock blinked 2:17 a.m. The fluorescent lights hummed. Thomas rewrapped his hands, palms steady now, and listened while Charles sketched the outline of how they would do it. Who to call, where to post, how to make sure the fight would be witnessed by the people who mattered most. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas didn't feel invisible. He felt like someone preparing to step back into the light. Another clip, another caption, this one crueler. Some people just can't accept their limitations. The comments below were a swamp of mockery and racist bile. Thomas stared at the screen until the words blurred, then saw Karen's face from Sunday night, tears on her pillow. The image lodged like a fist in his chest. Charles slid a plan across the table like a clean plate. You challenge him in the comments, he said. Make it about respect. Make it about dignity. Force him to accept or look like a coward in front of the people who matter to his brand. Thomas read the words, felt their weight. And if I lose? He asked. You won't, Charles said, steady as a metronome. 30 years of coaching. Joseph's a regional amateur with the loudest mouth. You're a trained fighter who's been holding back because you're decent. This is tactical. This is how you stop him. He rewrapped his hands, old leather straps whispering as they crossed over knuckles. The ritual steadied him. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas felt like himself. At 3:47 a.m., he typed and hit send, a line cut clean through the noise. You want to settle this like men? I challenge you to face me in the ring. Winner takes all. Loser leaves Iron Forge permanently, unless you're afraid to fight someone who might actually fight back. Thomas. By dawn, the comment had gone viral. Likes multiplied. Followers tagged Joseph. The carefully curated image of the gym's alpha male was being publicly questioned. Silence from Joseph began to look like cowardice. When Joseph arrived that Tuesday, the buzz had metastasized. Local MMA forums were debating odds. Betting pages took wagers. Amateur fighters planned a show. "You really gonna fight the janitor?" George asked, curiosity replacing derision. Joseph didn't have to answer. His ego did it for him. Backing down would be a brand-ending admission. Winning would turn him into legend. By Friday night, Iron Forge Academy had been transformed. What was usually a training floor became an arena. Phones rose like chandeliers. Live streams flickered across screens. Jessica set up a reservation list. Over 200 requests poured in. Local bloggers called. The press smelled a story. Joseph trained loud and public, posting stories of grueling sessions with captions like, "Teaching some hard lessons." He fed his followers the narrative he needed, that he was about to humble a delusional upstart. Thomas trained in the dark. Charles opened the gym at dawn for private work. He watched the way Thomas moved. Combinations precise enough to be surgical, defense carved from years of repetition, conditioning that denied time had ever dulled it. There was no showmanship, only readiness. When Saturday arrived, the taped rectangle on the floor looked like a modern-day coliseum. Charles was in Thomas's corner. Joseph had picked George to hold pads and hand water. Jessica, uneasy, volunteered as referee. 3 3-minute rounds, she announced into the charged quiet. Or until someone can't continue. Touch gloves and keep it clean. Joseph bounced, loud and confident. Trash talk for the cameras. "Hope you're ready, janitor. Time to learn your place." Thomas didn't move. He breathed, slow and steady. His eyes were narrow, held like a laser on the task. No show, no taunt. Just focus. Around them, people leaned forward. Phones recorded. Bets changed hands. The room hummed with electric expectation. This was no longer private. This was a reckoning. When Joseph extended his gloves for the customary touch, Thomas met them without theatrics, just quiet respect. There was no bell, only Jessica's voice, firm and steady. "Fight!" Joseph lunged forward instantly, fists flying in wild arcs. He wanted spectacle, a quick knockout, a viral clip that would restore his image. But Thomas wasn't there. The first punch sliced empty air as Thomas slipped right with surgical precision. The second whooshed past as Thomas ducked. The third, a desperate overhand, sailed harmlessly above his head as Thomas stepped inside the arc, calm as a man crossing a street. The crowd shifted uneasily. Where was the carnage? Why wasn't the janitor swinging back? Thomas spent the first round in defense, a ghost weaving through Joseph's rage. Every strike was slipped, blocked, or neutralized with the ease of decades in combat. He landed only 3 punches, light, surgical jabs that snapped Joseph's head back, proof of control, proof of dominance. By the time Joseph staggered to his corner, sweat pouring and lungs heaving, the humiliation was louder than the cheers. "Why won't he fight?" Joseph panted to George. "Maybe because he doesn't need to," George muttered, realization dawning. Round 2. Joseph tried to reset, to be tactical, but his foundation crumbled. Thomas opened up, not with violence but with precision. A clean jab-cross combination. A body hook that folded Joseph at the waist. An uppercut that tore his mouthguard free and drew gasps from the crowd. The audience was on its feet, phones aloft, recording every brutal truth. Joseph, the so-called alpha of Iron Forge, was being dismantled by the man he had mocked as just the help. "This isn't a fight," Charles whispered between rounds. "This is a clinic." Round 3. It barely began. Joseph, desperate and unraveling, rushed forward with a looping right cross, pouring the last of his strength into a single reckless punch. Thomas stepped inside. His left hand rose, precise and calm, and delivered a hook to the jaw with the sound of wood splitting. Crack! Joseph collapsed instantly, body limp, pride shattered. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the hiss of phones capturing the knockout that would end one man's empire and resurrect another's legacy. Thomas knelt beside him, combat medicine instincts taking over. He checked the pulse, the breath. When Joseph's eyes fluttered open half a minute later, Thomas helped him sit up, steadying him like a brother. "You all right?" he asked softly. Joseph nodded, weak and broken. The crowd erupted, not just cheers but something more. Awe? Within minutes, the footage spread online. Justice for Thomas trended within the hour. Professional fighters reposted the clip with commentary. Flawless technique, controlled violence, that's mastery. Joseph's reputation wasn't bruised, it was obliterated. Years of branding and ego undone in 10 seconds of truth. But as Thomas helped his enemy to his feet, showing the dignity Joseph had never shown him, he didn't know that the real fight was yet to come. Because Joseph woke the next morning not to silence, but to chaos. His name was everywhere, his defeat dissected, his legacy a punchline. And his first call was not to a doctor, but to a lawyer. "I need to see you immediately," he growled into the phone, jaw throbbing. "I'm filing assault charges." By Monday morning, Joseph had begun his reinvention. On Friday, he was the bully crumpled on the mat. Now he was the victim, a man brutalized by his unstable janitor. His lawyer, Matthew, polished the story like a blade. "Thomas is a dangerous man," Kellerman told the Phoenix ABC affiliate. "My client feared for his life. What was supposed to be a light demonstration turned into a savage assault. This was premeditated violence, not sport." The media machine ate it up. The arrest at 6 a.m. Tuesday, squad cars rolled into Thomas's apartment complex. Karen stood frozen at the kitchen window as her father was led out in handcuffs, his wrists shackled, neighbors peeking through blinds and open doors. She was 17, but in that moment she felt both much older and unbearably small. Her father had always told her to be strong. Watching him forced into the back of a cruiser, she realized what strength really costs. Joseph's media blitz. Meanwhile, Joseph sat in studio chairs with gauze wrapped dramatically around his jaw. He spoke softly with the humility of a man who knew the cameras were his allies. "I gave Thomas a chance when no one else would," he told a sympathetic Channel 12 anchor. "I offered him structure, mentorship, and he repaid me with violence that nearly ended my life." The edited clips were surgical. The viral knockout punch looped endlessly, stripped from its context. No footage of the harassment, the insults, the orchestrated humiliation. Just one blow, framed as the eruption of a violent man with military training and a hidden temper. Algorithms did the rest. Feeds flooded with "Eag's justice for Joseph." Local Facebook groups fumed about dangerous criminals in our communities. The hashtag that had lifted Thomas, Justice for Thomas, was drowned beneath the new tide. The courtroom Thomas sat across from his public defender, Ashley, in a dingy consultation room. She was juggling 47 other cases. Her eyes were weary, her tone flat but not unkind. "They're pushing felony assault," she explained. "Workplace violence enhancement. They'll argue you concealed your combat skills. Stone's medical records mention concussion symptoms. Kellerman's demanding over $200,000 in damages. Medical costs, emotional trauma, lost income." Thomas listened in silence, jaw tight. Karen waited outside in the courthouse hallway, scrolling through her phone, watching Joseph give yet another interview. His jaw injury hadn't stopped him from talking. Suppression and silence. Kellerman moved quickly, filing motions to block the viral fight video as inflammatory. He argued it had been recorded without consent, a tainted piece of evidence. He painted Thomas not as a father, not as a survivor, but as a weaponized man who hid his training until it was too late. Jessica held evidence that could change everything. Complaints locked in her filing cabinet, security footage of Joseph's harassment, even recorded conversations where Joseph bragged about destroying Thomas. But the gym's investors had cornered her. "If you testify against Joseph, you'll be terminated immediately," warned Ronald, the Academy's biggest backer. "We can't afford liability. Don't even think about it." Joseph's rise. And while Thomas was booked and processed, Joseph's star rose higher. His road to recovery post went viral. His GoFundMe for medical expenses, complete with gauze-wrapped selfies, hit $50,000 in 4 days. New followers flooded his page, calling him an inspiration, a hard-working American betrayed by a dangerous criminal. It was a masterstroke of spin, the abuser reborn as martyr, the victim painted as monster. And Thomas, stripped of freedom, resources, and voice, sat in a cell wondering if truth could still survive in a world that preferred a well-told lie. The shift began not in a courtroom, but in a teenager's bedroom. Karen, exhausted by watching her father's name shredded daily across feeds and news anchors' scripts, opened her phone and pressed record. Her voice cracked, but her message was clear. "My dad is the kindest, most gentle man I know. He cleaned that gym every night to pay for my school clothes, to cover my mom's medical bills before she died. Joseph tormented him for 3 years, and no one stopped it." The video exploded. Within days, 3 million people had seen Karen's tear-streaked testimony. She showed the world the man beyond the headlines. Thomas with his Golden Gloves trophies. Thomas with his military service medals. Thomas coaching kids at community boxing programs. A father, a veteran, a fighter forced by desperation into a mop and bucket. Karen did what his lawyer couldn't. She humanized him. The prosecution's case. But inside the courtroom, Joseph's legal machine tightened its grip. Prosecutor Carroll stood before the bench, voice sharp with practiced authority. "Mr. Williams is not the victim," she declared. "He is a trained fighter, a man with extensive military and boxing experience, who chose to unleash potentially lethal force on an amateur athlete in what should have been a peaceful workplace setting." Her words cut deep. The prosecution painted Thomas as something worse than violent, deceptive, a wolf hiding in janitor's clothing. They argued that his training gave him an elevated responsibility to always show restraint, even when provoked. The preliminary hearing was packed. On one side, Joseph's loyalists, shirts emblazoned with "Justice for Joseph," signs about workplace safety. On the other, a swelling army of supporters from Karen's campaign. They wore no uniforms, just conviction, faces lit by a hashtag that refused to die. Justice for Thomas. Coach Charles sat in the back, hands tight around his phone. On it were recordings, 17 minutes of Joseph's unfiltered cruelty. Slurs, threats, promises to break Thomas until he snapped. Charles knew releasing them would risk his own career, maybe even his livelihood. But as he watched Thomas sit at the defense table facing 5 years in prison, he understood some truths cost more to stay silent about. That night, Charles uploaded the audio to a private YouTube channel and sent the link to Karen with a simple message. "Your father deserves better." The evidence breaks. Karen listened with shaking hands. The voice on the recording was undeniable. Joseph spewing hate, mocking Thomas, vowing to crush him until he did something stupid. By morning, the internet had a new fire. Justice for Thomas surged back with devastating force. News outlets replayed Joseph's voice on loop. Supporters who'd once wavered came roaring back, and Joseph's empire began collapsing in real time. Sponsors pulled out. Membership at Iron Forge dropped. His follower count plummeted from 200,000 to 30,000 in days. But Joseph wasn't finished. Cornered, exposed, and desperate, he turned back to the only battlefield left: the law. The trial begins. The Maricopa County Courthouse buzzed like a storm on opening day. Media vans clogged the street. Protesters clashed outside, chanting rival slogans. Police tightened security. Inside, Joseph looked nothing like the swaggering alpha of Iron Forge. He was smaller now, reputation stripped away, yet still dangerous because he had Kellerman. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," the attorney began, his tone smooth, unyielding. "This case is not about workplace harassment. It is not about hurt feelings. It is about one thing: a trained fighter who used potentially lethal force against an amateur who posed no real threat." He gestured toward Thomas. The defendant concealed his combat background, concealed his violent abilities, and then unleashed them recklessly. "One punch could have killed my client. This is not justice. It is assault." The words landed heavily. Despite the viral evidence, despite the sympathy outside, Kellerman still held the weapon Thomas feared most: the letter of the law. And in that courtroom, the law could still cut deeper than any punch. "Mr. Williams is not some helpless janitor," Kellerman thundered to the jury, his voice sharp as glass. He is a former Golden Gloves champion, a military combatives instructor, a man who knew exactly how dangerous his actions were. And the law is clear: with superior training comes superior responsibility. The prosecution leaned on the law like a weapon, but the defense had transformed. Ashley, once an overworked public defender juggling nearly 50 cases, now had an army behind her. Viral attention had drawn in high-profile civil rights attorneys, researchers, and experts, giving her tools she had never possessed before. Still, the battle was uphill. Arizona's statutes on assault weighed heavily against Thomas. Joseph's performance. Joseph took the stand in a neck brace, his jaw still tight from the knockout. His voice was calm, controlled, almost gentle. "I thought I was going to die," he said, eyes glistening for effect. "One moment we were having a friendly spar. The next I was unconscious. I still have nightmares about that punch." Kellerman guided him like a conductor with a fragile instrument. Joseph painted himself as a mentor, a man who had generously tried to channel Thomas's frustrations into something positive. He claimed Thomas suggested the fight that it was never meant to be real, just a demonstration turned violent. To the casual observer, it was convincing theater. But Walsh was ready. Cross-examination. She rose from the defense table like a blade unsheathed. "Mr. Stone," she began evenly, "on March 15th you told Coach Charles, and I quote, 'I'm going to break that boy down until he quits or does something stupid.' Do you deny saying that?" Joseph shifted in his seat. "I don't recall that specific conversation." "You called Mr. Williams boy consistently for 3 years, didn't you?" "I may have used casual terms." "Casual terms?" Walsh's voice sharpened. "We have 17 audio recordings of you using racially charged language. Are you telling this jury those were casual?" Color surged into Joseph's face. The victim mask was slipping. "You kicked over his mop bucket deliberately, didn't you?" "That was an accident." "You forced him to clean during peak training hours to humiliate him, didn't you?" "I needed the facility maintained." "You posted mocking videos of him online." "I was just showing that some people need to understand their limitations," Joseph snapped. The courtroom froze. That one sentence, unguarded, dripping with contempt, revealed the real Joseph more clearly than hours of testimony. The witnesses Jessica followed. She had been pressured to stay silent, warned she'd lose her job. But when she took the stand, her voice was steady. "I filed 7 formal complaints about Mr. Stone's harassment of Thomas," she testified. "Every time, I was told to drop it. Mr. Stone made it clear he wanted Thomas gone. He told me outright he'd find a way to make it happen." Then came Coach Charles. 30 years of experience gave his words gravity no jury could dismiss. "Joseph systematically abused Thomas for 3 years," Charles said firmly. "Racial slurs, intimidation, psychological warfare. He pushed Thomas until he snapped. This was not a workplace accident, it was a campaign." The secret recording sealed it. Joseph's own voice sneering, threatening, promising destruction. The jury leaned forward, listening not to lawyers but to Joseph incriminating himself. Thomas takes the stand. Finally, Thomas rose. He didn't posture, he didn't play to the cameras, he simply told the truth. He spoke about years of cleaning up deliberate spills without complaint, about double shifts endured in silence, about his daughter crying over cruel comments when Joseph's video went viral. "I kept my head down because I had to provide for Karen," Thomas said softly. "Every insult, every shove, I took it. I never fought back. Not until I had no choice. And even then I didn't fight to hurt him. I fought to survive." As he spoke, Joseph sat at the prosecutor's table, and the transformation was visible. The mask of victimhood melted, leaving only the bully exposed. The man who had strutted around Iron Forge as king of the hill now sat slumped, his lies unraveling in real time. For the first time in 3 years, Thomas was not invisible. He was undeniable. "I held back for 3 years because my daughter needed me to have that job," Thomas said, his voice low but steady. "I let him call me boy because Karen needed school clothes. I cleaned up his messes because Karen needed food on the table. I took his abuse because Karen needed a father who could provide for her. The words landed heavy in the hushed courtroom. Thomas wasn't performing, he was telling the truth, stripped bare. And Joseph couldn't stand it. "That's bullshit," he shouted, springing to his feet. "You wanted to fight. You loved showing off, making me look weak. You wanted to humiliate me." The room erupted in chaos. Stephanie banged her gavel for order, but Joseph wasn't done. His lawyer tugged at his sleeve, whispering for him to sit down. It was useless. "I gave you a job!" Joseph screamed, his face purple with fury. "I tried to help you, and you tried to kill me in front of everyone. You people always think you deserve more than you earn. You think you can intimidate your way to respect. Well, look where it got you, facing felony charges." Gasps filled the courtroom. Joseph's words, laced with rage and racism, detonated the last of his credibility. Everything Thomas and his supporters had claimed was now undeniable, laid bare by Joseph's own mouth. Security escorted him out, still ranting. Thomas remained at the defense table, calm, dignified, untouched by the storm. The verdict. The jury needed only 47 minutes. When the foreman stood, the air was electric. "On the charge of felony assault," he said, "we find the defendant, Thomas, not guilty." The courtroom erupted. Cheers thundered. Karen burst into tears, throwing her arms around her father as supporters shouted his name. Joseph slumped forward like a man struck, the words hammering away his last hope of vindication. Then came the final blow. "Furthermore," Stephanie Hawkins declared, "Mr. Stone is ordered to pay $75,000 in compensatory damages for legal fees, lost wages, and emotional distress." Joseph's face went pale. His expensive lawyer had just cost him more money than Thomas had made in 3 years. The fallout. The consequences were swift. Within hours, the Arizona Athletic Commission launched an investigation. Charles's recordings sealed Joseph's fate. 2 weeks later, the commission announced, "Joseph is permanently prohibited from operating any combat sports training facility in Arizona." Iron Forge Academy dropped him immediately, desperate to salvage its reputation. Sponsorships worth over $100,000 annually vanished overnight. His follower count, once in the hundreds of thousands, collapsed. Joseph was finished. Thomas, however, was finally free. A new beginning job offers flooded in from elite gyms, promising triple his janitor's salary and cushy contracts. He turned them all down. Instead, Thomas used his settlement and the wave of crowdfunding support to open his own space. Second Chance Defense Academy. "Everyone deserves to know how to protect themselves," he told local news crews. "But more importantly, everyone deserves dignity and respect." The academy wasn't just about fighting, it was about healing. Students paid on a sliding scale. Classes blended self-defense with conflict de-escalation, and what Thomas called warrior ethics. True strength, he told every class, comes from protecting others, not dominating them. Karen, now heading to Arizona State on scholarship, became the academy's social media manager. Her videos of her father teaching precise technique, always paired with lessons in respect, went viral, reaching millions. Coach Charles stood proudly beside Thomas as his business partner, and among the first new students was George, Joseph's former prize pupil, finally learning what real martial arts looked like under the patient guidance of the man, once forced to clean his sweat. Thomas had gone from invisible janitor to teacher, mentor, and symbol of resilience. And this time, the world was watching. Joseph's collapse was swift and merciless. Once the self-proclaimed alpha of Iron Forge Academy, he now swept floors at a chain gym in Nevada for minimum wage. Lawsuits from 3 former employees, armed with Charles's damning recordings, drained what little money he had left. Every month, new legal fees piled onto his growing mountain of debt. Meanwhile, the world moved on without him. A movement is born. The hashtag #Justice for Thomas evolved, reborn as Doster's second chance defense. It no longer belonged to one man, but to a movement, one that redefined martial arts culture around respect, inclusion, and warrior ethics instead of toxic bravado. Professional fighters began traveling to Phoenix not to see Joseph's empire, but to train with the man who had dismantled it. Thomas, the janitor who became a symbol. His perfect technique and unshakable dignity had exposed the truth that strength without character is nothing but noise. Within 6 months, Second Chance Defense Academy was no longer just a gym. It was a revolution, a place where true warriors lifted others up instead of tearing them down. Joseph's punishment wasn't prison, nor just financial ruin. It was having to watch Thomas become everything he had pretended to be: respected, admired, and deeply loved by the people who mattered. 1 year later, Thomas stood in the middle of his own academy, now a thriving 6,000 square foot facility in downtown Phoenix, and smiled. Around him, the mats buzzed with life. 12-year-old Brenda, daughter of the gym's former manager, drilled defensive maneuvers with quiet determination, learning skills that might one day shield her from the kind of cruelty that nearly broke Thomas. Kids practiced anti-bullying strategies. Senior citizens worked on practical self-defense. Former gang members trained beside suburban parents. Everyone united under one philosophy: respect and dignity are earned by character, not by violence. Ripples across the world. What began in Phoenix spread like wildfire. Over 300 gyms across North America adopted the Thomas standards: mandatory anti-harassment policies, ethics-driven instruction, and zero tolerance for discrimination. The International Mixed Martial Arts Federation created an annual Thomas Award, honoring instructors who embodied warrior ethics in their communities. And Karen? She soared. She graduated from Arizona State with honors, her sociology thesis from janitor to hero. How Social Media Amplifies Justice Movements became required reading at multiple universities. Accepted into Harvard Law, she pledged to specialize in workplace discrimination cases. My father taught me that real strength isn't about winning fights, she told an audience during her viral TEDx talk, viewed more than 2 million times. It's about having the courage to stand up, especially when standing up costs you everything. Joseph, a cautionary tale. By contrast, Joseph became a footnote, a case study in downfall. At 37, he worked shifts at a failing gym in rural Montana. His house was gone. His sponsors had evaporated. His once booming social media following had crumbled to dust. Each time he tried to rebrand, the internet answered with the same receipts: his own words, his own actions. Joseph's story was soon taught in business ethics classes, not as a tale of fighting, but of arrogance, racism, and the cost of unchecked ego. Legacy of a Fighter. The documentary Second Chance, the Thomas story, premiered at Sundance, earning critical acclaim for its raw portrayal of workplace racism and viral justice. Netflix picked it up, bringing Thomas's journey into 40 million homes worldwide. Professional fighters flocked to his academy. Former UFC champion George called Thomas the most important martial arts instructor in America today. Through donations from Second Chance Defense supporters, the academy funded scholarships for more than 400 low-income students every year. Kids who couldn't afford training found not just skills, but a safe community. Thomas's philosophy was carved into the academy walls. Everyone deserves the tools to protect themselves, and the wisdom to use those tools with responsibility. It wasn't just the motto of a gym, it was the creed of a movement that had turned one man's survival into a global call for dignity. Coach Charles, now in his 60s, carried himself with the same steady authority he always had, but with a new pride. He was head instructor at Second Chance Defense Academy. Thomas had stepped back from daily training, devoting more of his energy to expanding their anti-bullying programs into public schools. What had started as a community experiment was now a blueprint for change. 17 school districts had adopted the curriculum, reporting bullying incidents reduced by more than 60%. George, once Joseph's prize student, now stood tall in his own right. Under Thomas's guidance, he had gone undefeated as an amateur and was making his professional debut. His social media posts carried none of Joseph's arrogance. Instead, they consistently credited his growth to the lessons he learned at Second Chance Defense. Technique matters, but values matter more. Real warriors protect. The academy's walls told their own story. Hundreds of thank you letters lined the halls. Notes from kids who had found courage, parents who had found relief, and adults who had finally stood up to ghosts from their past. Stories of bullying victims who discovered confidence. Stories of bystanders who chose finally not to remain silent. Jessica managed the academy now, her testimony against Joseph having cost her a job at Iron Forge, but earning her something far more valuable: integrity, purpose, and the knowledge that she had helped save an innocent man's life. A simple routine. Thomas's mornings hadn't changed. He still arrived early. He still mopped his own floors. But there was one difference. These were his floors, in a place built on principles he would never compromise. In the center of the facility, the heavy bag that had first betrayed his secret hung in a place of honor. Beneath it, a plaque read, "Sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates." It was no longer a reminder of humiliation. It was a symbol of rebirth. The Warrior Way. Across the main wall, written in Thomas's own hand, was the Academy's mission statement. "We teach people to fight so they'll never have to fight. We build strength so our students can protect the weak. We demand respect by showing respect. This is the Warrior Way." The words weren't just philosophy, they were practice. On those mats, children sparred beside veterans, women learned to defend against violence, and former rivals trained side by side, reshaping not only their bodies but their character. As the afternoon sun streamed through the wide windows, casting long golden shadows across the gym, Thomas watched Brenda, just 12, practicing the defensive maneuvers that would one day shield her from harm. Former enemies clapped for each other. Parents watched with pride. Thomas smiled quietly. He had once been invisible, a janitor surviving humiliation for the sake of his daughter. But out of that pain had come purpose. Out of defeat had come victory. It had taken 20 years, but he had found it. The true fight was never about dominance, but about dignity. Some victories are worth waiting for.